So I shared my stories, a couple of my stories about thin place in my life. But as I think about the thin place between heaven and earth, one figure from our Universalist history stands out. And I want to share something of his story. George de Benneville was born in London in 1703, but he ended up in Pennsylvania. But long before that move, when he was still in Europe, George de Benneville became very, very sick. In fact, he was so sick that he was declared dead. Now, I wasn't there, so I don't know, but the story goes that he actually died and was placed in a coffin. And during that time, he says he felt his soul separate from his body. He had visions of angels who took him through hell, where he saw tremendous suffering. People were hurting one another, being mean to one another, making painful, horrible choices. They were focused on their own ugliness or their own lacking or their own failures. And then an angel guided him away from hell and away from all that suffering and told him that he should return to his life and share the message that all people have the capacity for restoration, for wholeness, for beauty and strength. But first, the angel took George de Benneville one more time back to hell, where de Benneville was surprised to see that there was no longer any suffering or pain there. No one was hurting one another. No one was acting from self-interest or greed or despair. 42 hours after George de Benneville was declared dead, he woke up in his coffin with a fierce desire to preach that all people are saved, that all people are beloved. He spoke of being called to honor what he called the ocean of love. But his messages of love were not well accepted. He was excommunicated from his church. He was imprisoned more than once and almost executed for his beliefs. He finally moved to Pennsylvania and lived among people from other European religious groups who were, like him, less focused on creeds and doctrine and more focused on how to live their lives. He built a farm out in Oley, Pennsylvania, out toward Reading. And on this land, the barn had an upstairs room that could fit up to 50 people, and people would come in secret and hear his blasphemous messages that there is revelation beyond the Bible, and that personal experience can be a path to truth and wisdom, and that we're all part of this one interdependent ocean of love. George de Benneville was a pioneer of our Universalist faith, preaching all over the Mid-Atlantic, although he doesn't actually get a whole lot of attention. In fact, his historic farmhouse in Oley, Pennsylvania, last I saw, was divided up as a rental property and goes on and off the market from time to time. A few years ago, I tried to convince my husband that we had to buy it and restore it to its true historic purpose. We did not buy it, but it finally sold for about a third of its initial listing price. Although sometimes I like to imagine living on that farm, meditating in that upstairs room where de Benneville gave his messages of love. I also know that thin spaces, though, are sometimes not about the actual space, the actual location, the barn itself, so much as it is about our willingness to be open to restoration, or open to wholeness, or beauty, or strength, or our capacity for healing and love. Or as some of you have told me in the small groups, those places where we experience an absence of anxiety, those places where the senses shift, what it means to be alive, the essence of being alive, where I feel my separateness dissolving, where I feel expansive, where the obligations and material things that we're always worried about fall away, where we're no longer reaching. That place where we remember that deeper connection to the interconnectedness of where we all originate. A return to calm, oneness, where time stands still. That disposition of openness. How do we get there then, if it's not an address that we can just show up at? When the pandemic first started, an editor for the Greenville Neighbors magazine invited me to submit an article on coping. Things were already sort of chaotic and a little uncertain, and I didn't have a lot of time to commit to this, but I rushed off an article for them to include. And over a month later, I received my copy of the magazine. And at this point, things were way more complicated than they were when I wrote that article. Things were way more chaotic, way more uncertain. We were deep into this pandemic and all of the suffering, the deaths, the illnesses, the economic despair. And as I read my advice on coping from March, it felt like this early in the pandemic Pam was reaching out to give the deep in it Pam some much needed advice. And all I offered were 3 things to help us get through this pandemic. I said, just imagine that one thing that you can do for your mind or your body or your spirit. And maybe it's simply writing down for whom or what you are grateful for. Making a list. For whom and what are you grateful for? Or maybe it's simply focusing on your breath. Slowing down and focusing on your breath. Maybe it's writing a card or making a phone call to a loved one. Maybe it's moving your body, doing yoga or dancing or walking. What is that one thing you could be doing for your mind or your body or your spirit or maybe all of it together? And then you need to do 3 things. 1, implement some kind of structure. How often and for how long are you going to engage in this process? Every day, every other day, and for how long? 5 minutes? 20 minutes? Implement structure. And then 2, just commit to it. Just do it. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Show up and do it even when you cannot remember why you are doing it. And then 3rd, focus on the process, not the outcome. I have a spin teacher who once told me in a really excruciating spin class when I was in pain, she said, when you feel the pain, smile. And I think often of during that, now when I have these harder moments, I think about that. I think about smiling, embracing the moment. This is the moment I've been given. Even when it's challenging, smile. How can I live into this moment? It doesn't have to be perfect. I don't have to emerge from meditation as some enlightened guru. I just need to be present. And so find something to do and make a plan for doing it. Commit to it, and then just stay in the process. That's it. A quote came to my attention in the last week, which essentially said that sometimes you look around and everything is really dark all around you, and you think you've been buried. But what if you've actually been planted? And so you just need to grow and bloom. You don't have to die to come back from the dead. You simply need to commit to a practice that will nurture yourself back to life. What will your practice be to return to your sense of calm? Before George de Bonneville could get to that thin place between heaven and earth, he actually had to have another kind of thin space experience long before that. De Bonneville's mother died while giving birth to him. His godmother was Queen Anne, and so it came to be that he grew up in the royal court in England. As you might imagine, that privilege went to his head, and he was, by his own admission, hard to be around. When he was 12 years old, they put him on a boat where he worked as a midshipman. He was still an adolescent working on a ship. They had stopped in Algiers along the Mediterranean coast of Africa. De Benneville, himself Christian and also white, had learned the lie of the superiority of Christianity over other religions and the lie of superiority of being white. While in Algiers, he observed Muslim people of color going about their lives and was surprised to observe that they are good people. In fact, he observed them caring for one another in a way that he saw as more inspired and more loving than people of his own faith or his own race. And I'd like to believe that he returned home and simply embraced this newfound belief that all people are saved and beloved, and that ethnicity and nationality, race, religion, and other markers of identity do not need to divide us. No group is better than another. But that's not what happened to him, at least not right away. Instead, he came home and he experienced a horrible vision of himself burning in hell. Then he had 15 months of debilitating depression in which he felt worthless and despairing, like he was a nobody. He felt all his failures and mistakes and wrongdoings bubbling up. And for those who have read Robin DiAngelo's book, you know we have a term for this. We call it white fragility, which is that knee-jerk response felt by people with skin privilege when they feel that awful discomfort in their inherited beliefs against people of color. What George de Benneville was experiencing was that self-blame, that guilt for all the times that he tried to minimize segregation in his own community or tried to blame others for the segregation, or the times when he responded negatively to the term Black Lives Matter because he thought it was a little too political, or because he wasn't ready to give up or even name out loud his privilege. After all, he had struggles too, just like everyone else. He probably felt bad for all the times he tried to convince himself and others that he didn't see race, because he suddenly realized that we all see race. And all of that guilt and shame made him stuck. But he kept wrestling with it, and luckily for George de Benneville, after 15 months of suffering and wrestling, he had a second vision. He wrote, "I discovered between justice and me, the criminal, one of the most majestic appearance, whose beauty and brightness and grandeur cannot be described. He cast a look of grace and mercy upon me and regarded me with such love as penetrated my whole being and animated my soul with so pure a flame that I loved him again with a reciprocal love." Essentially, what de Benneville was experiencing was Jesus intervening on his behalf. Remember, he was Christian, and so Jesus was his orientation, and he saw Jesus intervening for him, this criminal, this sinner. And de Benneville realized that if he, who understood himself as chief of all sinners, was beloved, if he was beloved, everyone must be beloved. And he had no choice but to commit his life to dismantling any beliefs, habits, systems, structures, institutions, any ways of life that contradicted the truth, that truth with a capital T, that all people are beloved. He had no choice but to commit his life to leaning into that discomfort, looking within for those places of prejudice and examining systems outside of him that also embody prejudice. Because here's the thing. People of color were literally losing their lives over those prejudiced beliefs. And he was convinced that there was nothing so important in this life than to right that wrong. And de Benneville's preaching so threatened people with power and privilege that he was excommunicated from his church, persecuted, and almost beheaded. But he kept on preaching. Even in his exile, he kept on preaching. George de Benneville wrote, "The inner spirit makes us feel that behind every appearance of diversity, there is an interdependent unity of all things." He found this connection to all people, regardless of their belief, regardless of their skin color. And once he truly felt that oneness, that interdependence, his guilt over their circumstances lessened because his empathy got so big that it was no longer about him, but about people whose lives were on the line. He stopped caring whether Black Lives Matter sounded too political because he was too busy trying to ensure that Black lives mattered in his thoughts, in his actions, in the world. He started reading books by Black people, seeking out stories of transgendered people of color whose stories he didn't know. He sought out Black-owned businesses and invested his money back in urban areas still suffering from white flight. He spoke up when his white friends didn't understand their own privilege and power and racism. And in my version of this 18th century story, George made phone calls around the country and sent emails to ensure that people showed up to vote, not just for the president, but also for local elections too, because there's a lot of power and a lot of possibility, and it matters who is running our cities and our counties and our school boards. And he did that personal work too, which is sometimes the hardest work of all. It's that work of noticing when you aren't responding to another person's true self, but instead to your own sort of brainwashed ideas about that person's skin color or their hair or their clothes or their accent. That's stuff that gets in the way of us seeing their true self. De Benneville reminds us that the inner spirit makes us feel that behind every appearance of diversity, there is an interdependent unity of all things. Thin places, then, could also be understood as those places where the walls between us and another person grow thin. Thin places are the places where the walls between groups of people who seem different, but those walls are porous so that empathy can slip through, so that understanding can slip through, so that what makes us different can draw us together instead of keeping us apart. When those spaces are thin, you see years of oppression, and instead of beating yourself up about it, you imagine ways to draw close, to connect to communities, to live as if there is an interdependent unity of all things and all people, and you set out to manifest that. You know, this story is the story of one man's life, and I might have embellished it a little. Inserted some anachronisms here and there, but I didn't embellish the most impossible part, like the fact that this guy, as they say, came back from the dead with a renewed spirit for life. The parts where I diverged on the story are the easier parts, really, the parts that our universalist faith is asking us to take up. Things like living in this time and place as if Black lives do matter. We read books by Black people. We seek out the stories of transgendered people of color. We seek out Black-owned businesses and support them and invest our money back into urban areas still suffering from white flight. We speak up when our white friends don't understand their own privilege and their power and their racism. We make those phone calls around the country and locally to ensure that people show up to vote, not just for president, but for local elections too. And we do that personal work noticing when we are not responding to a person's true self, but instead when we are responding to our brainwashed ideas about their skin color or their hair or their clothes or their accent. Because here's the thing, people are dying. People are still dying because we are doing more to maintain those walls between us than we are to make those walls thin between us. And we say their names. George Floyd, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. And we hold up to every beloved who, because of their color of their skin, is afraid of the police. Every beloved who, because of the color of their skin, cannot trust that calling 911 is the best course of action for them or their family, no matter what harm is being done to them in that moment. Every beloved who, because of their color of their skin, is afraid to simply go for a walk or send their child out to play or ask someone in a public park to please leash their dog, or to go into a high-end store in an affluent neighborhood just because the color of their skin and the ways in which people have been brainwashed and predisposed toward fear. And this is not simply a police issue. This is a racial justice in America issue. We have got to start educating the racism out of not just our police officers, but also educating the racism out of our teachers, our nurses, our doctors, our retail workers, our counselors, our neighbors, our children, ourselves. We have got to hold everyone accountable for the ways in which their ideas are perpetuating old ideas of white supremacy and privilege and power. We have got to do this work so that we don't hand down these lies to yet another generation. Yesterday afternoon, I was walking through downtown Wilmington before the vandalism and before the looting, and a thought occurred to me. I wondered, how do we prevent another resurgence of rage like that which followed the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, when here in Wilmington, riots ensued and the armed National Guard was brought in to black neighborhoods where they stayed for 9 months. I wondered, how do we prevent that? And then I woke up and I remembered, we've had 50 years to be working on that question. And the question is not how to prevent the National Guard from moving into downtown Wilmington, but how do we build the kind of community that does not inspire rage? The governor and mayor of Minneapolis, where protests have been ongoing, have reported that local protesters are actually quite peaceful. But the worst of the violence is enacted by outside anarchist groups who are not from the area and who are white. That's not to say there isn't a lot of rage out there, but that rage is not about one man's death by a police officer. That rage is an understandable response to our country's general history of slowness in charging people with murder when the victim is brown or black. If today, as you are reading the news, you need something to be outraged about, I hope it is outrage at the injustice in our country. I think as a country, we have not been outraged enough about the trend in failures to diagnose COVID-19 cases among African Americans and the ways in which brown and black people are carrying the brunt of this virus and its economic impact. I think as a city, we have not been outraged enough at the recent spike in deaths of youth and young adults of color here in Wilmington to gun violence. We have not been outraged enough at the disparity between North Wilmington and downtown, or the alarming disparities of wealth, or the unjust incarceration of brown and black people. How did we get to a place where the country was willing to stay home and essentially shut down the economy for weeks to protect the most vulnerable in our communities from a virus? Yet we have never taken anything near that kind of risk to right the wrongs of white supremacy, which continue to weaken and kill the lives of countless people of color every day, many of them right here in Wilmington, with few headlines, no monitoring of the numbers, no apologies or sense of urgency or alarm from people in power. How are we living in a place where brown and black families in our own neighborhoods are holding their children close and terrified that an officer might accidentally enter the wrong home and shoot first? Or terrified that their child playing at the park could get shot? Those walls, those divisions, these broken relationships, and all of that pain and suffering, in religious terms, we call that hell. And we are of a religion that says that there is no hell in the afterlife. And so it is our religious quest to eliminate hell in this life. We are meant to love the hell out of this world. And so what if we choose to take our diversity and use it to thin the walls between us? What if we take our diversity and use it to experience the absence of anxiety with one another, to create those places where the senses shift, to get in touch with what it means to be alive, the essence of being alive, where we feel our separateness dissolving, where we feel expansive, where the obligations and material things that we were always worried about, they fall away. We're no longer reaching. That place where we remember that deeper connection to the interconnectedness of all, where we all originate. That feeling of calm. That feeling of calm in our relationships. That oneness where time stands still. Where we embody a disposition of openness. Because here's the thing I'm wondering about. We are in a strange place in history. Everything things are starting to reopen, but there's so much that isn't going back to normal. And I wonder whether this is the time where things are upside down and backwards, and we might actually be able to shift what is normal toward the seemingly impossible ideals of our faith. As we head into summer, one of the things I'm thinking about is how are we in this time of darkness, this sense of darkness, manifesting life and love? How in this time of beautiful, sacred darkness are we cultivating something that will grow out into the world in life-giving ways? How are we experiencing those thin places personally? You know, those places where heaven and earth collapse, where we feel connected to God or Spirit. And how are we experiencing those thin places with others? Those places where divisions lessen and we feel a oneness with one another, even amidst our diversity. And more importantly, what will we do in our lives with that incredible sense of unity?